Hey there and welcome back to another Marvel video. And recently, I went to see the latest entrant into the MCU with the release of Thor: Love and Thunder. And coming into this film, I was decently hyped up. I was pretty pumped to see Thor again, to see the Guardians of the Galaxy, even though I figured they wouldn't be in the film very long, to see Jane Foster come back as Mighty Thor, to see Gorr the God Butcher, Zeus, just so much to be excited about. And so when I was first watching it, I thought, yeah, this is good. I'm enjoying myself. This is a decent superhero film. There were some plot points that I kind of disliked, but for the most part I thought it was great. And yet, ever since I got out of the cinema, more and more I found myself reflecting on the film and finding more and more things that kind of bothered me. Like, don't get me wrong, I thought the film was still good, I still enjoyed it, but maybe it wasn't as good as I thought it was, and in hindsight, it was a little bit of a letdown that didn't live up to its potential, and was actually pretty hit or miss in a number of ways. Now, I'm not going to be a doomsayer and say that Marvel's losing their touch or that we're coming to the end of the MCU, but more that I think they might need to go back to the drawing board and try to reinvent things a little bit. I don't know. But anyway, with that being said, let's jump into the review and talk about the good and the bad of Thor: Love and Thunder. And disclaimer, spoilers ahead. Major spoilers. So yeah, either you don't care about spoilers or you've watched the movie if you linger from here on out. So here we go. So Thor: Love and Thunder picks up from where we left off with Thor's character, recovering from an extreme bout of depression and PTSD, and travelling with the Guardians of the Galaxy. Off-screen, we've seen that he's managed to get himself in shape, but that he's still missing something in his life. He lacks a purpose, a direction. He just goes from world to world, fighting battles and cracking down on tyrants and invaders. And he feels like his life is just missing something. After seeing a distress signal from his friend Civ, he travels to her location, and she warns him that Gorr the God Butcher, a warrior who wields the Necro Sword and seeks the death of all gods as reparation for their sins and the death of his daughter and culture, is coming after the Asgardians. And so off they go to New Asgard to fight off his minions, where it's revealed that Jane Foster's taken possession of Mjolnir and managed to repair it, and now wields its power as Mighty Thor. Also, she has terminal cancer, and she and Thor are clearly still in love, even after all this time. 8 years, in fact. Anyway, the Asgardian children get snatched by Gorr, and Thor, and Valkyrie and Korg go off to try and save them. And in search of a godly army to try and face off with Gorr, the four make their way to Omnipotent City to petition Zeus. But that fails, and Zeus supposedly kills Korg, before supposedly being killed by Thor in return. And so, with their plan scuppered, our trio and Korg's head make their way to the Shadow Realm, with Jane revealing she has terminal cancer and rekindling her romance with Thor along the way. As the movie's only halfway through, Gorr of course defeats them quite easily and steals Stormbreaker, forcing Valkyrie and Jane into hospital, with the latter on her last legs due to the strain of using Mjolnir exacerbating her cancer. In a last-ditch effort to save the children and prevent Gorr wiping out all gods using a wish to the being Eternity, Thor, armed with Zeus's Thunderbolt, makes his way to face him. And despite empowering the children of Asgard, he's still unable to defeat Gorr, prompting Jane to make the save, sacrificing her life to help him destroy the Necro Sword before ascending to Valhalla. And meanwhile, Gorr uses the last few seconds of his life to revive his daughter with his wish, whom Thor vows to care for, becoming the duo Love and Thunder. And yeah, the story itself, it's fine I think. It's nothing special, but it's not like it's bad. It does what it needs to do and it's enjoyable and engaging. But there are definitely some problems. And one of them, and maybe the biggest one, is that the film's pacing is really wonky. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it tries to do too much. The start of the film is really heavily loaded up with all this setup, like so much setup, but there isn't that much payoff to balance it out. It felt like most of it went to the cutting room floor. We had Jane's whole cancer diagnosis and chemotherapy treatment, shifting into her going to find Mjolnir. We had Thor fighting in some random alien world with the Guardians of the Galaxy that really does seem to have minimal relevance to the story, but kind of needed to be there to set up what Thor's been doing since Endgame, and set up his whole finding himself arc. We also had the Gorr origin story scenes to set up his God Butcher arc, and we also needed to see what Valkyrie's been doing in New Asgard, and how that's been working out for her as king. And all these stories, they feel like they need to be stretched out into, I don't know, more than one film. Clearly they needed the Gorr stuff in here, and honestly, it seems like a shit ton of his scenes got cut out of the movie, because realistically he doesn't do jack shit. He has his origin, he kills gods, but he kills them off screen, so no real god butchery except for that very first guy in the prologue. He attacks Asgard and kidnaps the children, and fights Thor a few times before he dies. It felt very much like he'd been underutilized in the final cut. And speaking of which, this brings us to Valkyrie. Her story was a bit off for me as well, and also felt like the victim of cuts. It felt like we were going to have a story where she's struggling to adapt as king, and that seemed like where it was going, with her introduction doing the diplomacy and the public relations, and how everybody looks to Thor for guidance when he arrives and not her. But then that sort of just drops out of the film completely, and she doesn't really do anything else other than be a side hero who gets KO'd by the villain and can't come to the final fight. Also, don't all Asgardians have super strength and power? One of these parents isn't going to step up to go help Thor fight? Maybe he could send one of those ultra-powerful heroes a text message, the ones he's friends with, saying, "Hey, someone's trying to genocide gods, help please." I mean, I know it's classic MCU to have the heroes just be incompetent and never ask for help, but still. But back on topic, Valkyrie just vanishes. So we're kind of left with a half-baked Gore story, which is hard to care about, as we never really hear from him beyond some generic evil scenes. And there's not enough of those scenes. And then this pivots into Thor adopting the kid at the end as his purpose, which wraps up his arc for the film, and honestly I was fine with that. I feel like the Gore/Thor dynamic leading into him adopting the kid really should have been the main focus of the film by far, and have Jane's cancer simmering in the background alongside Valkyrie and the bureaucratic troubles. And then in a future film, you could address those as a more major focus. So that way, you could have this film have them as a side story, and then they can take the main focus next time. Instead, there was just too much going on. And on top of that, it makes it harder to care that Jane's dead, because we hadn't seen her for years, and then boom, she comes back, and then boom, she's dead. Like, she was good in this film, but it was still hard to care. Having an extra film with her slowly getting sicker and sicker and eventually dying saving Thor like in this film, I feel like would have made for a better, more well-rounded arc. But on the other hand, I also understand why they went in this direction. They want to set up a new era for Thor in this film. And I am excited, I just think they needed to spend a little bit more time wrapping up the loose ends. There's no shame in taking your time to tell a more complete story, even if some of the other arcs have to carry over into a different movie. But here, it felt like they planted a lot of seeds, with many of them seemingly dropped out of nowhere, rather than being obviously left alone to grow in the background. And so in a lot of ways, the story just didn't feel very complete. And I get that these films make up a wider whole, but they also need to tell a story of their own, a complete story, and I don't think that's what we got. And it's a shame, because apart from those overarching story issues, the film actually has a lot going for it. For starters, the acting and portrayals are top-notch, particularly Natalie Portman as Jane Foster and Christian Bale as Gore. For me, Jane was very much like Thor, in that her early portrayals, they didn't capture me. Like, the acting was good, but the script wasn't getting the most out of the character. She was just the generic beautiful scientist. But here they added depth to the character. The cringy cheesiness where she tries to think up fun catchphrases and act all tough like she thinks a Thor should. The grief and despair that comes with having a terminal illness with no hope of a cure, with even Viking space magic failing to save her. The slow rekindle of her feelings for Thor, and the regret for all the time that they missed out on during the breakup. It's just great stuff. And then Bale as Gore. Man, he was really good for what we got, but I feel like the edit left him down. There needed to be more of him. I wanted more out of the character, because what we did get was eerie and creepy and tragic, and there wasn't enough of it. Same with Valkyrie, really. It was a good performance for the scenes that she did have, but in the end, she felt like she was very minimized in the edit, and her character never got that moment to shine, which made the performance less memorable. But on the other hand, I did like that some of the minor characters got to shine a bit more. In particular, I enjoyed Zeus, with Russell Crowe doing a classic Greek Australian accent that just made me giggle. And whilst that scene probably lingered a little too long, it was more because I wanted to actually get to the main villain again. It wasn't the performances themselves that were bad. They were actually very good. It's just, the scene lingered too long, and it took us away from the main story too long for something that ultimately didn't matter as much. But obviously, based on the post-credits scene, it is a setup for the future. And this brings me to the big banana himself, Thor. And once again, I very much prefer the more strange and outlandish buffoon as opposed to the grumpy warrior. But I'm starting to wonder if they're leaning a little too heavily on that persona. Like, it is funny, but after a while, if you do it too much, the laughter does stop. And I think that started for me. And I'm not sitting here asking for him to become some edgelord or go all gritty like Batman or something, but I think they need to hit the brakes a little bit and go back to more Ragnarok style. Still silly, but not as silly. That level. I think it's enough that he's goofy most of the time, and then he gets serious when he needs to, as opposed to being ridiculously goofy almost all the time, and then only getting serious for a second, and then he's back to goofy Thor again. But really, I think that's just more of a nitpick than anything else. I just don't want him to get flanderized. But apart from those complaints, it is all good. The visuals, I thought they were great. The music, it was great. The world building and the setting up for future stories, that was done well with the Zeus thing and then showing Valhalla, because I'm expecting that Thor's story is going to one day end with all the heroes of Valhalla returning for one last battle against some cosmic deity with Thor ascending at the end. I mean, isn't that kind of the point of Valhalla? They aid the All-Father in the final battle. It's a place where the great warriors rest and prepare for the final war. I think it would be a nice way to finish off his story one day, having Jane and Heimdall and all the rest come and save his ass. But in the meantime, it looks like he's going up against Hercules for his next outing, or Hercules is at least appearing in the MCU at some form. Whether that's against Thor or against another hero entirely, who knows. But regardless, I think I'm hyped. More for Zeus than anything, but I'll take Herc as well, why not? So yeah, I like the film a lot, but I do think it could have been better. Perhaps it was a little bit too ambitious for one film. I think if the arcs were divided over 2 Thor films, it would have flowed a bit better, but maybe that's just me. But anyway, with that being said, these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the film if you've seen it? Like it? Hate it? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.